It is fashionable to say that the country started on some sunny day on July 1st on Parliament Hill in 1867. My friends, that is a convenient date, and it marks a constitutional bringing together of the people that lived in British North America, or at least a lot of them, not all of them at that time. But it is folly to say that that is the beginning of the country, because in point of fact, people who speak English and people who speak French lived together for several hundred years before that took place. In addition, our Aboriginal peoples were here. And surely, looking back on it now, we must confess that they should have been included in 1867, and it is to our shame that they weren't. And it is our hope now that they will be included. But the reality of life in Canada is that we did live together for a long time. And we lived together under certain understandings. Let me take you back a little bit in history. We cannot go back far enough with accuracy in the Aboriginal history of our country, but we can remember when our French-speaking citizens came to North America. We can also remember that in those days the relationship at first between the Europeans when they got here and our own native people was one of friendship. We have to go on a bit and remember the British conquest of Quebec in 1759. Not because we want to open old wounds, but we want to remember what happened after 1759. Because the British, in their wisdom at that time, guaranteed to our French-speaking citizens in the St. Lawrence the language, religion, and religion was a much bigger thing then than it is today, the education of their children, and the civil law. I am not here to debate the semantics of the word distinct society, but most certainly that was the beginning of it. One can say, well, so what? Well, let's take a look at 1776, the start of the American Revolution. Does anybody really believe that British North America could have survived that enormous upheaval if the French in the St. Lawrence had decided to join the 13 colonies? Let us come a little farther along and see the War of 1812. It's a war that Americans don't like to remember because they lost it. We ought to remember it because we won it. But can anybody really believe that if our French-speaking citizens had not stayed loyal, we would have been able to turn back the American armies that were coming up into Canada? Have we forgotten Chateauguay? When a British commander with 500 British troops, that's what your history book will tell you, turned back an army of 7,000 Americans. The 500 British troops were 90% French-speaking. Have we forgotten so quickly the rebellions of 1837 and 38? And have we not asked ourselves, or have we forgotten to ask ourselves, or have we forgotten completely that if those rebellions had had the full support of our French-speaking citizens in the St. Lawrence, does anybody really believe that by 1867 we would have put together a constitution that brought together most of the English-speaking and all of the French-speaking, most of the French-speaking people in Canada? I could go on. We went through the period of the Fenian raids. We went through the First World War with difficulty. And there were great strains on this country. but there were not sufficient strains to break it apart, fragile as some historians have said the unity was. And my father enlisted in the First World War and was before he became a pilot, he was a stretcher bearer in a unit called the 4th Field Ambulance, the Canadian Army. And as he told me, the first 2 days he was in action in 1915, he was on the right flank of a French-speaking Canadian infantry regiment. And as he said, 600 of them went into the line, and 300 came back, and I carried half of them out. Consider the depression. Consider the fact that we came through that together. Consider also the Second World War. And consider the numbers of people in this country that took on our obligations to meet the terror, the danger, and the awesome force of Nazism. We did it together. Have we forgotten so quickly that we put nearly 1 million men and women in arms? If we've forgotten, there are reasons for it. I saw a text on current world history in Alberta a few weeks ago when I was hunting there. I was hunting with a young lad who said, "This is the book we're studying on." Written by Americans, published in the United States. It had a comment that it had been adjusted for Canadian schools, and there was a one-page insert on the whole of the First World War. It's because we are forgetting our history that when we have difficulties now, we have nothing to turn to. We do not have the memory of what we have done together, how brave our people have been, and how remarkably unselfish, and how wise at times. One can carry on after the Second World War. We met the challenge of the Korean conflict. 25,000 Canadians served there. And if my memory is correct, the enlistment rate for the forces in Korea were higher on a per capita basis out of the province of Quebec than any other province. I served modestly in the armed forces at that time. A third of the officer cadets I served with and later officers were French-speaking, and a third to half of my training officers were all French-speaking members of the Canadian Armed Forces. We went through all of the difficulties of the changes in Quebec and then the changes in Canada. We brought hundreds and thousands of people here from all over the world, and we found a way to live together, and for the most part, to leave our enmities, our resentments behind. After many years of hard work and unselfishness on both sides, both English-speaking and French-speaking, we had the referendum of nearly 10 years ago in which Quebec voted 60% to stay with the country. And yet we are told by some people, including historians and others, that the only hope for Canada is to split up. It seems to me a very strange way to talk about the future. When you consider what we have done together and what we still have to do together. I have been running, along with a lot of help, parliamentary exchange program, bringing to Canada members of Parliament from the Eastern and Central European countries, including the Soviet Union. I've just come back from Czechoslovakia. I've been in Poland and Hungary, the Soviet Union. And of course they are interested in the constitutional debate which we're having among ourselves. But wherever you go in those countries, they will tell you the same thing. They will say, We will trade our problems for yours any day. And how could it be a people who have done so much and are still so favored would put their country at risk? Perhaps some of us have had it too good, but a lot of us haven't. Perhaps some people, over the past decades, have lost track of how hard so many of us worked and so many of our ancestors worked to build the country we have. It was not done by defeatism. It was not done by meanness. It was not done by ungenerosity. It was done because people believed in something and they believed in each other. I sometimes say to people, look around you. Look at each other. You know each other. You know what you believe in. You know what you all believe in. Every poll seems to show that if one can get off the particular annoyance or grievance, most Canadians want to keep this country together. But it can't be done by just complaining. And it can't be done just by finding fault with everyone and everything about this place. It is astonishing to me that even in the political sphere, and here I have to tread cautiously, there are politicians who seem to think that the only purpose for electing a person is to represent that particular riding or that particular region. And of course, if that is the only purpose for electing anybody to the National House of Commons, then one may as well send a delegate. The task of governing through our democratic system is greater than that, because when we are elected to the House of Commons, yes, we have to represent our riding, and yes, we have to represent the views of the people in our region. And most of us understand that, and most of us have done it again and again and again. But we also, in doing that duty, have to look after, for instance, my riding is Vancouver South. I have to worry about the public interest of people in St. John's, in Carrick, Toronto, in Ottawa, Mississauga, Montreal, Trois-Rivières, Regina, Edmonton, Winnipeg, the Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. This is something that the best people that you send to the House of Commons learn. And most of us learn it pretty rapidly. And most of us try very hard at it. But it is not just enough to do it in the House of Commons. As citizens, we have to be able to think that way also. That it is not just the grievance of our own backyard that must take up all our time and our attention, sometimes our vocal annoyance. We have to think in terms of each other. And if we do, we suddenly see an extra dimension to being Canadian. Anybody can do a bookkeeping account of this country. It wouldn't be very difficult, for instance, to find over the last number of months accountants and learned men and women who give different versions about what might happen if this country broke up. It's not very difficult to get economists to give different versions about what's going to happen to the country even if it stays together. Matter of fact, I'm reminded that I once took economics. I got a first class. I've never really trusted economists ever since, but that's another matter. So my point is that if we want to save this country, and I think most of us do, we've got to start remembering our history, remembering what we have done together, and remembering that what brought us together is that we did care for each other, and that we thought it was better to be together than to be separate and apart. But it is intensely important that all of us say this. It's not enough just to argue about the different constitutional versions that are floating about the country. The question that has to be asked is, to what degree will they maintain our unity? What degree will they make sure that all Canadians are cared for? And what degree will they secure our future? If anybody thinks that anyone is going to come up with an absolutely perfect set of constitutional proposals, then we're living in an academic dreamland. The BNA Act wasn't perfect, but it served us very well. The British don't even have a written constitution. And we have to remember that the Lord put us imperfect into an imperfect world. I'm neither a theologian nor a philosopher, so I can't tell you why, but I can say that the Lord most certainly did just that. To expect absolute perfection in a written document is, as I say, living in a dreamland. We have to get enough down and on paper that we can agree to, and there may be some things we will have to agree to later. But nobody should be approaching this on the basis of it's either or. If after all, that is what my ancestors and some of yours had in mind, we'd have never put the country together in the first place. We have to think of this country in terms that make us realize how intensely fortunate we really are. And one could say, that doesn't sound so complicated. It's not complicated, but it's a matter of spirit, not just academic or intellectual nitpicking. What it amounts to is saying, yes, we're Canadians. We've been Canadians a long time. We know why we are Canadians. We know how lucky we are to be Canadians. And we're not going to let it slip between our fingers, and we're not going to let anybody talk us into letting it slip between our fingers. You know, MacDonald said this. He said, "We are a great country and shall become one of the greatest in the world if we preserve it. We shall sink into insignificance and adversity if we suffer it to be broken." Georges Etienne Cartier said in 1867, when Canadian Confederation was achieved, and I'm grateful to a Grant Maxwell from Victoria who put this in the paper the other day and reminded us of it. He said, "All it took was fairness, justice, and some compromise on both sides." And then he said, "I hope that if it," meaning the British North America Act, "must be amended, it will not be to narrow the principles of fairness on which it is founded, but rather to enlarge them even more." Surely that is our task. There are people who have been left out. It's now time to bring them in. There are things that were not put in the original British North America Act, and it's time to include them. There are aspects of life today that were not thought about 125 years ago, or in some respects even 10 or 11 years ago when we had our last round at the Constitution. And these things should be considered. But always they must be considered on the basis that we have a country that we are proud of, that has been a model
to most of the world that has defied all the prognostications of failure which made its early beginnings and which can be maintained if we can remember what put us together in the first place, and if we can maintain the spirit of being Canadian that has made this such a magnificent place. There are the faint of heart, and you have heard them, and so have I, who say it isn't worth it and it can't be done. There will always be those people, but they are not the people to take counsel from at this time in our nation's history. It will take courage, and at times a lot of courage. But let us remember something that Winston Churchill said when he was asked, what is the greatest quality a person can have? And he said, courage, because it secures all others. My friends, we have a magnificent country. We have a country to save, and I believe we can do it. Thank you.